Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to talk about going from zero to disaster recovery in about an hour with VMware Site Recovery. And we'll cover this as a technical overview. Thank you all very much for being here. My name is GS Kalsa. I work in technical marketing in the storage and availability business unit here at VMware. And let's get started. So here's the agenda we're going to cover today. Just do an overview of the VMware Cloud on AWS service. We'll talk about the architecture, talk about use cases and topologies, the deployment options, and kind of walk you through what a deployment would look like. We'll talk about a little bit about replication, and then we'll talk about protection and recovery and reporting. So first off, quick overview of VMware Site Recovery for VMware Cloud on AWS. And we're going to start with talking about specifically about VMware Cloud on AWS. So if you're not familiar with VMware Cloud on AWS, the idea of this service is we have bare metal hardware running inside of AWS data centers. And all of that is sold, operated, and supported by VMware. And those bare metal servers are running Vsphere, NSX, vSAN, and in this case, VMware Site Recovery. The idea is that it's as similar as possible to an on-prem environment. And it basically is like an on-prem environment in terms of, it's the same software, it's the same versions of the software, all of those details, with the added benefit of it being in an AWS data center and having the benefits of cloud, both from a scalability standpoint of being able to easily scale up and scale down as needed, as well as proximity and ease of connection to all of the native AWS services that AWS offers. And then the connection to your on-prem environment, since everything is basically the same, we're still talking about vCenter, you're still talking about NSX, vSAN, all of those things. The connection to your on-prem environment is seamless as well. We provide a way of a hybrid linked mode that gives you a single pane of glass access to both your on-prem as well as your VMware Cloud on AWS environments. And there's nothing that you have to do differently for your basic administrative tasks. There's nothing that you have to do differently within VMware Cloud on AWS compared with your regular environment. So one of the cool things that we are able to do with VMware Cloud on AWS is we're able to be a lot more dynamic about introducing new features. Since this is done in a cloud environment as opposed to in your on-prem, we're able to more easily and dynamically add and deploy new features. And we make our roadmap public as well. So there's a link on this page, that link down towards the bottom, cloud.vmware.com/VMC AWS roadmap. You can check there to see our current roadmap, and you can see the different features that are either available or in preview or that we're developing or that we're planning, just depending on those features. And today we'll talk about one or two of the features that are currently in preview, but it's something that it's a cool aspect of it that we're able to make those more available and be more open and communicative about those. So we covered the basics of VMware Cloud on AWS. What's going on that we decided to do something about disaster recovery as part of VMware Cloud on AWS. And really what that comes down to is that there's a lot, we still find that there's a lot of customers that have little or no DR strategy. If they do have it, it might just be limited to tier 1 applications. The process of setting up and deploying disaster recovery is complex and difficult. And then the ongoing operations of that disaster recovery are expensive, both in terms of dollars, but also in terms of management and maintenance. So definitely not an ideal situation, and a solution like VMware Cloud on AWS lends itself really well to the disaster recovery use case. So let's talk a little bit more about how specifically that is. We already talked about the idea that VMware Cloud on AWS provides a consistent environment. And from a DR standpoint, that's especially important because in a disaster is not when you want to be trying to figure out how to use a new interface, how you want to be interacting with a new interface. VMware Cloud on AWS provides that consistent environment. There's no conversions that your VMs have to go through. You don't have to change your applications. You don't have to change really anything about the VM other than possibly the IP address for that VM, depending on your networking requirements. The other thing is that we provide is VMware Site Recovery gives you a really simple way to run your DR plan. It gives you a way of your DR plan is just going to start, just going to run as you would expect. There's not a whole lot of complexity in getting it set up and configured to be up and running. And if you're familiar at all with Site Recovery Manager, those tools are the same tools that you would otherwise use. We support non-disruptive testing as well. So you have the ability to test your DR plan as frequently as possible if that's what's needed. And then the added thing is that since this is done within VMware Cloud on AWS, we have the ability to apply cloud economics. So you have the ability to protect VMs when you need them protected. You have the ability to scale up and scale down the environment as needed. By protecting those VMs when they need to be protected, you only would incur cost for those VMs when they're protected. So there's no additional things that have to go on there. So VMware Site Recovery is purpose-built for VMware Cloud on AWS, and it's built on the proven DR solutions that VMware has available. So here we're talking about VMware Site Recovery Manager and Vsphere Replication. And we give you the ability to have an automated DR runbook. You've got bi-directional protections, and you can protect VMs in either direction. Your reprotect and failover is really easy to handle and walk through. And then everything is deeply integrated with the rest of the VMware stack. So everything works really well together. We talked just briefly about it, but these are built, VMware Site Recovery is built on Site Recovery Manager and Vsphere Replication. Site Recovery Manager has been around for more than 10 years. There's over 20,000 customers using VMware Site Recovery Manager, millions of VMs protected, thousands and thousands of VMs that have been successfully recovered. It provides that non-disruptive testing capability to automated DR workflows and enables fast protection and reliable RTOs. And then Vsphere Replication is per VM level host-based replication. It's only going to be replicating your change data, and you can protect any VMs that are running on VMware storage with it. So VMware Site Recovery is going to provide a number of different capabilities. We're going to give you that non-disruptive testing capability. So you have the ability to run a test and verify that your recovery plan is going to work the way that you expect it to, and have that be non-disruptive to your production environment. You're going to have automated failover. So obviously the thing that you're looking for in a DR solution is the ability to get your workloads moved over from one site to another, get your applications started up as you need it to, have all, and organize and take care of those things all within the solution. We have automated failback, so after you fail over, it's easy to re-protect your workloads, so reverse replication, reverse protection, get those running in the opposite direction, and either fail over or migrate back when you need to. And then, of course, we offer detailed reporting, so any recording requirements that you have as far as supporting financial, business, or regulatory requirements, we can provide the reporting for those to meet those requirements. Since this solution is based on Site Recovery Manager, we also support a number of different topologies. So we support Site Recovery can interoperate with Site Recovery Manager. So from your primary on-prem location, maybe you already have a DR location, but you're looking for another one, or you want to start migrating or utilizing some of the services that are available as part of VMC. You can have a DR situation that includes some VMs that are protected from your main site to another on-prem location, and then other VMs that are protected into VMware Cloud on AWS. One of the things that's currently in preview is fan-in topology support. So having multiple remote sites protected to the same VMware Cloud on AWS site. So that's going to be supported in the future as well. We're currently, this is currently in preview, so if it's something that you're interested in, there's the possibility that you can get in on that preview, but if not, if you start using the service, it's something that's going to be more than likely available soon. We also have a new capability, something else that's currently in preview, which is a new instance type, so a new piece of physical hardware within VMware Cloud on AWS that gives you an ability to dynamically scale the storage for the hosts in your environment. And what that means is that you're going to have the ability to dynamically change how much storage your hosts are providing. And what that would give you the ability to do is to have, say your on-prem environment was 10 hosts, and you want to keep your VMware Cloud on AWS environment smaller when you're not failed over to it. You'd be able to keep potentially something like 3 hosts, have those 3 hosts have significantly more storage allocated to them, and then in the event of a disaster, you scale up the hosts to correspond. You add additional hosts to give you the compute and memory to match the storage that you already had. So lots of interesting and dynamic options there when it comes to how those solutions can play out. So the architecture for VMware Site Recovery, what does that look like? So of course, you're going to have Vsphere, vCenter, and storage at both ends. So within VMware Cloud on AWS, you're going to have all of those things that are managed by VMware. And at your site, you're going to have whatever storage that is. It doesn't vSphere replication isn't dependent on a particular kind of storage, so that storage can be vSAN. Can be vVols, can be local storage, VMFS, whatever makes sense. You're going to have your vSphere hosts, and then you're going to have vCenter. And one of the things to note with vCenter is the vCenter version on-prem we support multiple versions of that. So you can run either 6.0, U3, 6.5, or 6.7. And then you're going to have Site Recovery Manager server and your vSphere replication appliance deployed on-prem as well. The idea, the reason that we have all of these components and why they're duplicated, why do we have a vCenter at both sites, SRM server at both sites, vSphere replication at both sites. why we have both of those and we have everything at both sites is we want each site to be completely independent from the other one. So if your on-prem location is completely unavailable, all networking is down, or the site is just completely destroyed, we want VMC to have nothing that depends on that. So all of your data has been replicated, and we have all of the tools that we need to get everything stood back up and get you back up and running with no dependencies on your on-prem environment. So one of the other things that we also do is we also support protection between SDDC instances. So instances of your software-defined data center within VMware Cloud and AWS, just between regions, as an example, you could use VMware Cloud. You could use VMware Site Recovery to protect between those. Just another one of the cool use cases here, the added benefit of this is that all components for the entire solution would be deployed, managed, and maintained by VMware. So there's nothing from, that would be an entire DR solution that isn't, everything is managed and maintained by VMware. We already talked briefly about this, but I just want to point it out again, is that we support, we have that flexible version support as far as vCenters go. So your on-prem environment, you don't have to worry about that on-prem environment matching exactly with the VMware Cloud on AWS version. You can run those multiple versions of vCenter that we were talking about. You can upgrade vCenter and Site Recovery Manager, Vsphere Replication, and just VMC in general will still operate just fine, even with those different versions. As far as connectivity goes, we have a number of different connectivity options when it comes to how you're going to connect into your VMware Cloud and AWS environment. You can use either just an IPsec VPN, you can do a VPN over Direct Connect, or you can actually do a layer 2 VPN, which would give you an option of not having to customize your IP addresses. I do see one question here, managed or supported by VMware. So just to be clear, the VMware Cloud on AWS service is something that's provided to the customer as a managed service from VMware. So you'll have access to, you would have access to the VMware Cloud environment. You're able to log into vCenter, you're able to deploy new VMs, you're able to create networks, you're able to, interact and customize the environment. But on the back end, VMware is managing and maintaining it. So we're taking care of the hardware. Really, actually, AWS is taking care of the hardware. We're taking care of making sure that the versions of the software that are running on there are supported and maintained. If there's any problems, we take care of removing, replacing hardware, upgrading, all of those things that as an administrator, not an operator, but as an administrator, you'd have to deal with. VMware is going to handle those for you. And that extends into the disaster recovery realm as well. So VMware would take care of making sure that the Site Recovery Manager server and the Vsphere Replication server within VMware Cloud and AWS, that those servers are operational and working the way that they're supposed to be, and that process is taken care of for you. Hopefully that answers that question. If not, if you provide more detail, I'm happy to drill more into that. So the limits that we're looking at are, the main limit that people would need to be concerned about or think about is the protected VMs. We support up to 1,000 protected VMs. We're currently working on upping that limit to support the same that we do on-prem, which is 2,000 VMs. Not quite there yet, just a question of getting some testing done. The thing to keep in mind there is that if you do have a requirement of doing more VMs than that, you could also look at deploying a second SDDC. So another question, for VMC to VMC, does the DR site need to be the same number of nodes? No, it doesn't. And that's actually the same either VMC to VMC or on-prem to VMC. You don't need to have the same number of nodes at both sites. You really just need whatever the capacity is that supports your environment. So, and again, keep in mind that with VMC, you have the ability to scale that environment up as needed. So you could potentially get by with less until you're ready to do the failover and then dynamically scale that up. The other question is, so we need additional licenses for SRM and vCenter for AWS vCenter. So just to be clear, the service with the VMware Cloud and AWS service, all of the costs are included in the price for that service. So you wouldn't have to bring or provide any licenses for any of the features that are available within VMware Cloud and AWS. So vCenter, vSphere, NSX, vSAN, all of those licenses are included as part of the packaged offering. You would need to provide licenses for your on-prem environment. And then also, just to be clear, from the way that VMware Site Recovery is licensed, or is the payment model for it, is that is done per protected VM per minute or per hour. So when you start replicating and protecting a VM, that VM would then you would start incurring the cost for that VM, for protecting that VM. But when you're not protecting the VM, there's no cost incurred from a VMware Site Recovery standpoint. And I really do appreciate these questions. Please keep them coming. I'd much rather this be a little bit dynamic and making sure that we're getting into and covering all of the detail that you want to cover. There are some things, and if it makes sense, if there's questions that don't make sense for me to answer right in that moment, just know that I will leave time at the end and make sure that all of everybody's questions get answered. So for use cases and topology, the main places that we see VMware Site Recovery utilize, the main use cases, would be for DR or disaster avoidance. Most people think of DR, and obviously that's the primary use case. That's going to give you the quickest RTO, give you that ability to recover from an unexpected failure. Far more often, though, the thing that we see is people using it for things like disaster avoidance. So when you can anticipate an outage, you see the floodwaters rising, the hurricane is on the horizon, whatever that is, giving you that ability to preventatively fail over and gracefully shut down to make sure that you don't incur any data loss. Let's see. One other question, I just want to hit this one because it's definitely relevant to what we're talking about, is does VMware also provide the service to recover the on-prem data center? Yes, that's exactly what VMware Site Recovery is doing. We're using that to recover the VMs that are running within your environment into the VMware Cloud and AWS environment. And from a cost perspective, just to clarify things, when you protect a VM, there's a cost per hour or per minute to protect a VM. There aren't additional. There might be a data transfer cost associated from AWS, but there's not any additional storage costs or anything like that. That's again all of the services that are part of VMware are provided by VMware and included in the overall price for the SDDC. There's a question about other storage options. things like basically array-based replication. We don't currently support that. There's some partners that are looking at providing those capabilities, but with the VMware Site Recovery Service, we're not currently providing that. Having VMs running old legacy applications on NT, there's, as long as your VM, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the section about vSphere application, but as long as your VMs support are running an operating system that's supported running on vSphere, they will they're fine to be replicated by vSphere application. And just to be clear, the only, from a cost standpoint, the only thing that VMware Cloud on AWS is, what that's supporting is the VMware Cloud on AWS environment. It's not providing support or administration for your on-prem environment. It's just handling support for your for the VMware Cloud on AWS environment. So what kind, different kinds of organizations or topologies that we support. Usually the thing that we would often see is customers using VMware Cloud on AWS in an active-active configuration. So you got VMs running at the customer site. Maybe your tier 1 and tier 2 run on-prem, and then something like your tier 3 and tier 4 workloads run within VMware Cloud on AWS. There's other ways of doing it as well. You could also have your VMware Cloud on AWS be more of an active-passive configuration, where your VMs, you're not really using the VMware Cloud on AWS environment for anything other than running like tier 0, so things like DNS and DHCP. The idea there would be that it just makes things simpler from a failover standpoint, that you wouldn't have to add capacity or change anything, power off VMs or things like that as part of that failover. But the active-active to me is what really makes a lot more sense. Some of the other options that we have are, again, this is currently in preview, this idea of elastic vSAN. So giving you the ability to scale up your storage within a host, anywhere, basically adjust a host anywhere from 15 to 35 terabytes. And the benefit that can give you is, again, that idea that you can run your the minimum number of VMs, the minimum number of hosts with a large amount of storage, and then in the event of a failover, you're able to increase the number of hosts to then match the storage requirements as part of that failover process. We also, and I mentioned this before, but we also support bi-directional failover. So if you have VMs running at the on-prem site that you want to protect to VMware Cloud on AWS, and other VMs that are running in VMware Cloud on AWS that you want to protect on-prem, you can support that bi-directionally as well. If you're interested or looking at using stretch clusters, and these stretch clusters could be either a stretch cluster within VMware Cloud on AWS or a stretch cluster on-prem and protecting that to VMware Cloud on AWS, both of those different topologies are supported. From a VMware Site Recovery standpoint, the way that it would treat a stretch cluster is it sees a stretch cluster as a single site. So it would treat it accordingly with that. Looking at deployment for VMware Cloud on AWS, it's kind of a 5-step easy process to get VMware Cloud on AWS deployed. And I'll walk through the steps in a little bit more detail in just a second. But just at a high level, you would first enable the VMware Cloud on AWS service. You then configure the firewall within VMware Cloud on AWS. while you're enabling that service, you can download and start deploying Vsphere Replication and Site Recovery Manager. After that, you would pair the sites and get your resources mapped. And then from there, you're able to start replicating and protecting your VMs. So very simple process, and let's look a little bit more in detail at some of it. So to get the service activated, you would just go into the VMware Cloud on AWS console, select under your add-ons. There's a site recovery add-on. You just click on activate. Once you click activate, it takes about 10 or 15 minutes for it to deploy those components. And again, this is VMware on the back end deploying and configuring VMware Site Recovery and Vsphere Replication within the VMware Cloud on AWS environment, taking care of configuring passwords, IP addresses, certificates, all those details that you need for that configuration. We take care of all of that. And then once that's done, it's just going to show as active and provide you with some links to your to managing those workloads. It also will provide links for downloading the on-prem components that you're going to need to install and configure. Configuring the firewall can be as easy or as complicated as you need. We support a really granular firewall, so if you have really high security requirements and you need to specify exactly how the traffic needs to flow and that it can't deviate from that, you can make that really specific. Apologies, I'm still getting over being sick. I imagine it's flu season and everything, so it's probably going around, but just need to take a little break every so often and take care of that. But so you can meet those requirements if they're really strict. You can create as many firewall rules as you need to meet those requirements, and we provide that guidance. If you need, if you're okay with having it be, less specific and less, of a high security configuration, we support that as well, where you keep those rules simpler and a little bit higher level. After those firewall rules are configured, again, you just need to download and deploy Vsphere Replication, which is just a simple OVF deployment, kind of standard configuration of picking where it's going to go, what networks it's going to connect to, IP addresses, passwords, NTP configurations, things like that. And you deploy Site Recovery Manager. Site Recovery Manager is a Windows server that would be deployed into your environment and then installed as an application. So get that deployed. And then you're ready to start pairing your resources. So you'd get get your two sites paired up, which is just a question of pointing them at each other and getting them aware of each other and ready to start mapping those resources. And then the next thing you have to do is map those resources. And the idea of mapping resources is we're talking about two separate vCenters. So, and the inventories of those two vCenters is not going to exactly match up. You're going to have a VM that's connected to, network 1 at your on-prem environment, and it needs to connect to network A at your VMware Cloud and AWS environment. So we need to just create some mappings for VMware Site Recovery so that it knows how to organize those things. And the things that we're going to map are, we're going to map your networks, we're going to map folders, and then we're going to map resource pools and storage policies. So all of those different things need to get, we need to map those out so that when VMware Site Recovery fails over those VMs, it knows where to place those VMs, where to connect them to, and where to put them so that they work exactly the way that you need them to. Once those mappings are created, then you can start replicating and protecting your VMs. And one of the things that we enhanced in this latest version of Site Recovery Manager is we combined the replication and protection workflows. So you actually have a combined workflow where you can you go through the process of replicating the VM, and then right after that, as part of that same workflow, you can replicate, after replicating the VM, you can add the VM to a protection group and to a recovery plan. So, looking at all that we just went through from a deployment standpoint, the customer's going to take care of getting SRM and VR deployed and configured on-prem. They're just going to activate the service within VMware Cloud and AWS. That's going to get SRM and VR deployed there. Configure the firewall, pair up the sites and map your resources, and then organize your protection groups, which is just groups of VMs that you want recovered together, and then add those protection groups to recovery plans. And we'll talk a little bit more about those two steps here in just a little bit. First off, though, we're going to talk about replication. So VMware Site Recovery utilizes Vsphere Replication, and Vsphere Replication provides flexible per VM level host-based replication. So what we're talking about here is, you've got individual VMs, and you're able to replicate individual VMs into, regardless of what storage those VMs are located on, regardless of, what operating system they're running, any of those things. Just lots of flexibility when it comes to how those are configured. We can protect any VM regardless of the operating system or the application that it's running. There are some specific storage situations that Vsphere Replication doesn't support. If you have a VM that is using a physical RDM, physical RDM, or a physical RDM or shared disk. Those are things that aren't currently supported with Vsphere Replication. But any other VM, and regardless of what application or what operating system is running on that VM, it's supported being replicated with Vsphere Replication. Those RPOs are flexible, so from 5 minutes to 24-hour RPOs, and those can be set per VM. And then we also support end-to-end network compression, as well as Windows VSS and Linux file system quiescing. And again, Vsphere Replication is compatible with any storage. So, it doesn't matter what the storage that's being used on-prem. We support, vSAN, regular SAN, block, file, local storage, vVols, all those different storage solutions are supported with VMware Cloud and AWS and with Vsphere Replication. So looking at the protection workflow, a protection group, we talked about this just briefly before. A protection group is just a group of VMs that are going to be recovered together. More often than not, the way that we see that organized is by application type. So, all the VMs that make up an application put into a protection group. That said, that doesn't have to be how it's done. Since I just covered this, I just see a question about RPO. So the RPO that Vsphere Replication supports, the lowest RPO is 5 minutes, and it supports anywhere from 5 minutes up to 24 hours. A VM can only belong to a single protection group. However, a protection group can belong to one or more recovery plans. So that gives you a lot of flexibility, and I'll talk a little bit more and cover more of that in some detail here in just a minute. When you organize those protection groups, the nice thing with using Vsphere Replication is, since it's independent of the storage, you don't have to worry about where your VMs are located, what storage they're located on when you think about organizing them into protection groups. You can basically just take your VMs and organize them into protection groups in whatever makes sense for you and for your environment. Again, we have that simplified workflow, so you can configure replication and protection all within that same workflow. Just makes that whole process a lot easier. Looking at recovery and recovery plans are where we would execute our workflows on. And what I mean by workflows is things like disaster recovery or planned migration or testing or reprotect. So you'd handle those at that level. When you look at how you would organize your protection groups into recovery plans, and this idea that recovery plans can belong to more than one protection group, this is where that really comes in as a benefit. In that you can have, in our example, we have our web application. Our web application is part of our recovery plan 1, so we can run a test of our web application or run a recovery for our web application by itself. However, we can also run either a test or a recovery for our entire site, which includes, again, that web application along with email and SharePoint. So having that just gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to run that and the way that you want to interoperate with it. Getting into some of the details of recovery plans and the capabilities there. So Site Recovery has a couple of different ways that it can make sure that your VMs start up in the order that you want them to. And what I'm talking about here is it's separate. You can separate your VMs into up to 5 different priority groups, and then within those priority groups, we can define dependencies. And the way that SRM and Vsphere Replication and VMware Site Recovery work is we're not just going to power on the VM and then move on to the next step. We're actually going to power on the VM, wait for VM tools heartbeats to respond, and then move on to the next one. So in this situation, where what we're outlining here, we'd power on that master database first, wait for VM tools heartbeats to respond. Then we move on to priority group 2. We'd power on both the database and Exchange server at the same time, wait for both of them for VM tools heartbeats to respond for both of them, and then we'd move on to the next one. So in priority group 3, we would power on app server 1 first, and then we have a dependency for app server 2. So we power on app server 1, wait for VM tools heartbeats to respond, and then move on to app server 2. So lots of granularity there, and the capability to make sure that your applications come up exactly the way that you need them to, so that they function the way that you need them to. Just a couple of screenshots showing what that looks like, where you can select that priority group for your VMs and where you can configure the dependencies for those VMs. From an IP address change standpoint, SRM has, VMware Site Recovery has some cool options when it comes to that. So you can configure IP customization per VM. So you could go through the process of saying, configuring each individual VM, this IP address changes to this IP address. That's fully supported. The really nice way to handle it, though, is using IP subnet mapping. And what IP subnet mapping means and does is it gives you the ability to add on to that network mapping. So we've already mapped our networks. We've already said, this VM that's connected to, in this example, VM network 1284, connect it to CG network 1 within VMware Cloud and AWS. What adding the subnet map on does is we say, 10.10.10.0 maps to 192.168.100.0. And so now if we have a VM that's connected to network 1284 and its IP address is 10.10.10.5, when we fail it over to VMware Cloud on AWS, it'll automatically have its IP address change to 192.168.100.5. So we change the network portion of the address and we leave the host portion the same. Just a really cool capability there for it being really easy to get your VMs protected and have those IP addresses change without having to individually configure custom IP addresses per VM. One of the other things that we can do from the standpoint of recovery is we can run post power on scripts. So we could have a script that runs on a VM that's recovered after that VM is recovered. So we get the VM recovered and powered on, and then we could run a script that does something like verify that the application is working the way that it's supposed to, that calls something on another VM, calls out to the VMware Cloud on AWS APIs and increases the number of hosts in the environment. Lots of different options when it comes to things that you can do, and lots of power to be gained from those post power on scripts and the capability there. If you have specific requirements for shutting down or starting up VMs, we can customize that as well. You can provide some different shutdown options, startup options, delays. If you have VMs that aren't using VM tools, you can remove that dependency there. So a number of different things that you can do. Thinking about, and I see a question. This is tied right to IP addresses. Is after failover, how would your clients find the re-IP'd VMs? So you would need to update your DNS as well, or just have your DNS. Really, you need to update your DNS. That's the easiest way to make that happen. Or some other way of updating your clients. So when we look at those workflows, we're going to walk through the different workflows here in just a second. And I saw there was a question or two earlier about that I hadn't answered yet about testing and keeping those testing environments isolated, and I'll get to that here in just a second. So we'll talk about the different workflows that we can do, the non-disruptive testing, the automated failover, automated failback, and then we'll look at reporting as well. Since we're talking about workflows, I see another question about how does migration work with Microsoft SQL servers? So if you think about it from the perspective of a VM, when we fail over a VM, you're replicating the data that makes up that VM. When you fail over the VM, you're just going to power off that VM at the source site and power it on at the recovery site. So from the VM's perspective, SQL is an example. You're going to shut down the SQL server at the source site, and then it's going to power on at the recovery site. So as long as you're just talking about an individual standalone SQL server, that's how that would work. The ability to non-disruptively test your recovery plan is a huge benefit to a solution like this, giving you that ability to non-disruptively test. And what that means is that you can more frequently run your DR tests and make sure that they're going to work. By doing them more frequently, you're reducing your risk. Just keep that in mind. If it's something that you don't already have, highly recommend taking a look into that and utilizing a solution that supports that kind of non-disruptive DR testing. So the way that we handle that non-disruptive testing is, from a storage standpoint, what we're going to do is we're going to take a snapshot of the storage at the recovery site. So you're replicating from the on-prem site to VMware Cloud on AWS. We're not going to impact the production VMs. We're not going to impact the replication, so no change to RPO. All that we're going to do is we're going to just take a snapshot of that replicated data within VMware Cloud on AWS and use that as the basis to power on those test VMs. From a networking standpoint, the thing that we're going to do is we're going to give you an ability to create a map to a test network. And that test network can either be something that VMware Site Recovery creates for you, in which case it would be isolated, the traffic would be isolated to a single host at the recovery site. Or you can actually create an isolated test network and have, when you run a test, have those VMs connect to that, and that would give you the ability to really test the functionality of your application. When you run your recovery plan, so when you actually run, that was talking about testing. When you actually run the recovery plan, the steps that you're going to walk through is we're going to synchronize replication. We're going to power off the VMs in the reverse order that we're going to power them on. We're going to synchronize them again to get any changes that occurred while we were powering those off. Then we're going to prep those recovery VMs, get them added into inventory, connected up to all their resources. We have the ability to optionally power off non-critical VMs at the recovery site. And then we can customize the IP addresses for the VMs and then power on those VMs in. That's basically the way that the running of a recovery plan works. The differences between running a recovery plan in DR mode or in plan migration mode just gives you some flexibility in terms of what you're trying to accomplish if you're more concerned with getting things stood back up and running as quickly as possible, or if you're more concerned with application consistency. So, if you're using disaster avoidance versus disaster recovery, couple different options there for how that's going to flow through. When we look at at fail back, if we start in this little diagram at the top in spot number 1, if we fail over from A to B, so our VMs are now running at site B, we can then run our reprotect, which is going to reverse replication and reverse protection to get us protected from B back to A. And then whenever we want or need to, we can either migrate or fail over again from B back to A. And then now our VMs are running in A again, and we run a reprotect again, which again reverses replication and reverses protection and gets us back to spot 1 again. And one of the big things to keep in mind with VMware Site Recovery is that all of this is managed and maintained by VMware Site Recovery. So it's not an individual setting, individual things that you need to do. When you run a reprotect or a failover, those workflows are predefined, and there's very little that you have to do other than just kicking off that workload, kicking off that workflow. From a reporting standpoint, and this is the last thing that I'm going to cover, and then I'll take the questions that we have. VMware Site Recovery does reporting both at a high level, so on the individual workflows that you run, it'll show what workflow was run, what the result was, what the date was, how long it took, who ran it. And then for each of those, there's also detailed, comprehensive reports that show every individual step of the recovery plan that went through, what the result was, how long it took, and all of that detail as well. So VMware Site Recovery is built for VMware Cloud on AWS. It's built on proven solutions, provides you with a lot of really cool capability. And let's get to some of these questions. Let's see. Already talked about the test network. Is the cost of active to passive the same as active to active? Yes, the cost for both of those would be the same. The reason for that is you're paying for the SDDC within VMware Cloud on AWS. If you're replicating the data into that, you'd have to pay for that replication. You're paying for that storage, so that's the reason for that. So as far as SQL Server goes, the question was, how does migration to SQL Server work? SQL failover around IP address changes. So that's something that you'd have to deal with on the application level. If your application supports IP address changes, then you do it that way. If it doesn't support it, you'd have to look at one of the ways that we have for not customizing IP addresses. There's plenty of customers who have failed over SQL, and it just depends on figuring out how, figuring out the details of how you're going to work through that. Questions around replicating or duplicating Active Directory environments. So it used to be that Microsoft didn't recommend replicating Active Directory, and I think in the last few years, I think as of Windows Server 2016, I think they now support it. The thing that I would recommend, though, and this is something to think about for a lot of applications, or at least a few applications, is there's some applications like Active Directory that provide application level availability. You know, there's Active Directory actively replicates its data to other AD servers within your environment. So it's providing its own level of resiliency. Sometimes that will work for you. So sometimes you don't need to protect an Active Directory server with VMware Site Recovery. You just deploy another Active Directory server at your recovery site, you know, within VMware Cloud and AWS, and just have that server there and have, you know, AD handle that replication. It does create some challenges when it comes to testing. There are still, you know, if you're interested, there's blogs that are out there that talk about that and how that works. But it's definitely something to think about. Really appreciate all of the questions. Really appreciate the interaction. If you have any more questions, I'm more than happy to take those. If